Hi, I'm grateful for the opportunity to introduce Arthur Green and to acknowledge both his expertise and his generosity. I met Arthur about 7 years ago when I was putting together an exhibit on Takanashi and the U.S. Life-Saving Service. And Beth Woolley said, oh, you've got to talk to Arthur because Takanashi used to be called Green Lake, right?
Green's Pond.
Green's Pond. And that was Arthur's family. And he goes back to before the revolution. So he knows everything you need to know. And she was absolutely right. And since then, I've learned that Arthur's, perhaps because his ancestors were in the Revolution and in the Civil War and in the War of 1812 and in the First World War and in the Mexican War and in the Second World War, he has had since a childhood a fascination with things military. And he refuses to allow me to call him an expert. What do you call yourself? A scholar, right? Yeah. Right. Okay. So he's a military scholar. I would call him an expert, but he knows an amazing amount, particularly not so much like what the battles were, although he knows a lot about that. What he specializes in is what was it like for that soldier in that war, and what was the equipment, and what was the implication and meaning of that equipment in terms of the victory or the loss in the war and the life of that soldier during the time he was fighting. So since I've met Arthur and we collaborated on Takanashi, we've done an exhibit on the Civil War, on World War II, and the current one on World War I. And in every case, he has opened up his unbelievably impressive collection. I mean, this is just the duplicates that he didn't loan us on World War I, and he has similar impressive collections on each of these conflicts. And he is just a delight to deal with. He has been generous beyond my ability to express to you in sharing his memorabilia and artifacts with us. And even more importantly to me, his expertise. He has taught me so much, and he is so patient with me, and he will proofread and figure. I'm trying to put the uniform on the mannequin, and he'll come in and tell me exactly what I've done wrong and how to do it right. And in addition to that, he does living history and has come in and spoken to the Ocean Township school children on the Civil War, dressed as a Confederate soldier. You may remember him because he was speaking here on the life of a Confederate soldier. And he did it recently, came in as a World War I soldier and spoke to some 6th graders. And he does this all as a volunteer for us. So I don't think I'll live long enough to thank him enough for all he's done for the museum. And I think he does community service as a volunteer fireman and any number of things I'm sure I don't know about. But he's a friend and an expert, and it's my pleasure to introduce him tonight to talk to you about the well-equipped Doughboy.
All right, well, thank you, Peggy, and hello again, all. Before I get into the items on the table, I'll clarify the remark that Peggy made. I'm not an expert, and I'll tell you why I'm not an expert. It's a little piece of advice that my father gave me a long time ago. Never claim to be an expert, because the moment that you're proven wrong, your credibility goes right down the toilet. So, I'm a scholar. I'm always learning, and unfortunately, with a lot of these things, or my interest in the field, a lot of times, the only way you learn something is what information's been handed to you. And I'm reluctant sometimes about giving information out to people because sometimes if my source wasn't the best at the time, and I've been proven wrong, I've had other people come up with collectors, advanced collectors, or people that have been in the hobby longer than me and have told me, well, that's actually not right. So I'm constantly evolving and constantly changing. So if you ask me a question about something, you'll be able to tell if I'm starting to get a little bit uncomfortable with my answers because I'm really not sure. And I'll tell you, well, I'm not really sure, but this is what I've been told. So what we're going to do is I'm going to cover, and as I think Peggy coined this, the well-equipped Doughboy. So we're going to be talking about the soldiers that volunteered and served in the First World War. But before we get into what's on the table here, there's a little bit of a backstory to all this. And the reason why they are were the well-equipped Doughboy. Before I even go to the term doughboy, we all heard the term doughboy. It actually is not a World War I term for an American soldier. The term doughboy actually goes back to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. And it has to do with the dust-colored uniforms of the soldiers. After trotting down these roads, they took on the form of the brown, tan, adobe brickwork and things that were in Mexico in the Mexican War. So the term doughboy actually predates World War I. It kind of fell out of use by World War II, and it wasn't really used a lot during the Civil War. It was prevalent during the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. The soldiers in the Spanish-American War were referred to as doughboys. Of course, World War I, which was relatively not long afterwards, but it kind of fell out of use by World War II. But getting back now, let's get to the heart of the matter here. The United States Army profited from and learned a lot from its experiences in the Spanish-American War, which was from 1898 to 1902. Now, the American Army at that time was really a very small peacekeeping army. I think at the beginning of the Spanish-American War, there was around 28,000 regular Army soldiers in the entire United States Army. 28,000, just more people living in the borough of West Long Branch than there was in the entire United States Army in 1898 when we entered the Spanish-American War. The government, the system was designed to work off of, and this was really for the taxpayers' purposes, a very small, full-time professional army, the regulars, and to be supplemented by, in need, volunteer, militia, or National Guard troops from the state. So they put the burden of having an army on the individual states. So that's where our National Guards came in. Problem with the National Guards were that the federal government, the president, had no jurisdiction over state troops. Only the governor of the state did. And the first time that got tested was at the Spanish-American War, when they needed troops to go to fight the Spanish army in the Philippines and in Cuba and Puerto Rico. They only had 28,000 men. Well, there was a law that kept National Guardsmen from leaving their jurisdictions. So you heard the term now, federalize the National Guard, and that's the only time that National Guardsmen can actually leave their states and operate out of their individual states. So that was something that had to be worked out during the Spanish-American War. And the problem here was because the regular army was very small, 28,000 men, the army was really looked upon really as a police force or a peacekeeping force. Remember, in the United States, we didn't have foreign acquisitions. We didn't have colonies like Germany had, France, Great Britain. We didn't have, outside of the continental United States, acquisitions in little hamlets and towns and islands. We didn't have any of that. So the United States Army was really a peacekeeping force, protect the borders, and keep whatever a few hostile Indians were left by the 1890s still under control. And this 28,000-man army was spread out between the West Coast and the East Coast, and from the Gulf of Mexico up to the borders of Canada. None of these officers at that time had ever seen, since the Civil War, probably more than 2 or 3 companies of men together. No officer had ever, at the time even World War I, had seen soldiers on a divisional level, thousands of men. It just didn't exist because the United States Army was a very small peacekeeping army. Also because of that, the soldiers were inadequately equipped. And the army in 1898, when they went off to fight the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, was pretty much an inadequate, inept army. As President McKinley said, God protects the drunks and the United States Army. It was by a joke that we actually even defeated the Spanish army in that. But it was because of that war that it opened up the eyes of the government. And the United States Army had, from 1898 and 1902, up to the beginning of World War I, for a major shakedown. And good thing that occurred, because had it not, the United States would not have been able to enter the First World War as a very effective fighting force. I did not bring, for just a lack of space and time, comparisons, but up until 1902, the United States Army was still wearing the old blue service uniform, where most all European countries had switched over to a more drabs and browns and khakis. We had a wool uniform only, where a lot of these other countries had a summer weight and a winter weight uniform, or depending upon where you were stationed, they would give you appropriate clothing to fit the climatic conditions you were in. The United States had none of that. Our weaponry, and as I go down, I'll explain the differences. The weaponry was found to be inapt in the Spanish-American War, so they refitted the Army. So by World War I, the United States Army was pretty much re-equipped, and most of this took place around 1910. And as I go down the line and I refer to these items, the model number is what I will give you of the item is the year it was adopted. That's usually when it was developed. And most all of this stuff dates from the period of about 1910. And to show you how well thought out it was, for anybody in this room that was a World War II veteran and or a Korean War veteran, you will probably recognize a lot of these items. They went unchanged from the changeover in 1910 all the way through the Korean War era. So that lays testament to the ingenuity and the redesigning of the equipment for the American fighting soldier. It was pretty much, it became stable, and it didn't really change until into like the late 50s, into the 60s, and the Army got revitalized with the new equipment and the new weaponry. All the items on this table here are original. Okay, now, so they are now 100 years old. Some of them, give or take, maybe even a little bit older. What a lot of people need to understand is we talk about the First World War. The United States' entry into that war, we were only in it for about a year. Now, the European nations, France, Great Britain, Belgium, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, Italy, they've been slugging this thing out for like 3 years by the time the Americans got in. And we, although our numbers were substantial, our involvement was not. Most soldiers that got overseas, John Pershing, refused to have the American soldiers be used as fillers within the ranks of the French and the British troops. He waited till there was enough American troops there that he could establish full-blown regiments and divisions of men, because he was not going to have American soldiers just laid to waste out there. So we were criticized for that greatly by Great Britain and France, because they needed manpower right away. Pershing held back and waited till he got the men there. And the Europeans, once the Americans did arrive, they really didn't know what to expect from us. They were very impressed with the American soldier. First of all, they were fresh, they were young, they were exuberant, they weren't worn down from 3 years of trench warfare that had decimated most of the European powers that were involved. The Americans coming into the First World War were decisive. That was the final knockout punch. Because at this point in time, the Axis powers realized with the arrival of the American troops into the scene of things, with the ability of the United States to produce weaponry, uniforms, and equipment, the tables had been turned. So obviously, they sued for peace by November 11th of 1918, and the war ended. And though Americans, this is our centennial. The Americans, I guess, the Americans were the deciding factor, really, for winning that war. If the Americans had not entered the First World War, it was still up in arms at that point. Remember, Germany had sued for peace with Russia. Their army was not divided again. They didn't have an Eastern Front and a Western Front. Germany was now able to move their forces all to the Western Front. Had the Americans not entered the conflict, who knows? Germany might have been able to win that war. The German Austria-Hungary Empire might have won that war. Also, what a lot of people don't realize is when the war was over, the United States got tied up for a very short time over in Russia. And we still had troops in Russia into the early 20s fighting the Bolsheviks. There were American troops that, after the armistice was signed in 1918 and 1919, the official, there were still American troops in Russia at the port of Archangel fighting Bolsheviks, something most people don't even know. There were a whole group of American soldiers that stayed on and fought into the early 20s, and eventually we pulled out. That's a little part of American history that most people don't even know about. But with that, I'm going to start to go down the line and explain everything that's on the table. If anybody has a question, if you want, just raise your hand, And for recording purposes, I'm going to repeat your question so it gets on the film. So with that, we're going to begin going down the line with the stuff. Now,
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
My father was on the Mexican border.
Okay.
He told my mother he joined the club, the National Guard, because there was Depression years, and when you went to meetings, you got paid.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the club sent him down to Texas for Pancho Villa.
Well, my wife's great uncle was with Jack Pershing in Mexico chasing Pancho Villa, the punitive expedition they called it. I probably should add that in. We had our own problems brewing in 1914 in the United States. Mexico was in the middle of a change in government again, and Pancho Villa, who once was an ally, and we had Americans that were advisors over there, Pancho Villa became kind of not an ally of us anymore. And trouble started with the Mexicans, the Mexican rebel army, when they started to cross over the border into Texas and rob and loot American banks for money. His big mistake came when he actually he ran into a group of National Guardsmen and he killed a couple of American soldiers. And after that, it was off and running. The United States entered Mexico with an army without permission from the Mexico government. Just crossed over the border and went in and pursued Pancho Villa. And we had this going on in 1914, 15, 16, and it was only our entry into World War I that we pulled out of Mexico, or we might have ended up in some sort of a conflict with Mexico. There was a few times where the American army actually had battles with Mexican regulars along with the bandits, the bandit army, the rebel army. So there was a big trouble brewing right there with Mexico and the United States. And Jack Pershing had to pull the troops out. And the reason for that was, if anybody remembers their history, our involvement into World War I was brought in not by the Lusitania. Forget about the Lusitania. Lusitania had nothing to do with the United States entering World War I. Two things happened that brought us into World War I. The first thing was the Germans had reneged on their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, all shipping was now going to be fair game. Of course, that's what got the Lusitania sunk, but it was not the Lusitania that brought us into the war. It was the Germans backing off on their agreement of unrestricted submarine warfare. The other thing was, which involved Mexico. It's called the Zimmerman Letter. Oh, yeah, right. All right? The British had intercepted correspondence between the Mexican government and Germany about trying to keep the Americans busy or basically declare a war on the United States to keep us out. The Axis powers were afraid of the United States entering World War I. They figured if we were tied up with a war with Mexico, we would not get involved in the global conflict in Europe. And I think they promised Mexico, if they won that war, that they would give them their acquisitions back, like California, New Mexico. You know what? Frickin' give it to them now. I wish they had. But anyway, that's what the promise was there. But the Americans were smart. They didn't take the bait. They pulled out, and they mobilized to go to Europe. So the well-dressed doughboy. All right. This was the standard government issue uniform, and this gentleman probably stood about this big. All right. This was a standard wool model 1917 uniform that was worn by the American soldiers. This is what's referred to as the tunic. It is made of an olive drab wool. Along with that, well, when you find these now, it's hard to find. What a lot of people kind of have to understand is when you find these uniforms, these are not the uniforms that the soldiers wore overseas in the trenches. You are not allowed to bring any of that stuff home with you. All the soldiers were refitted and they were reclothed when they came back. They had the big parades and all that. They all were given new uniforms. So to find actual combat-worn uniforms are like non-existent. First, these things they wouldn't even look this good. And the first hint you find is when you find this little red chevron on the sleeve. This is called a discharge stripe. And you had to wear this on your uniform and put this on your uniform. This meant you were honorably discharged from the service. Also, for identification purposes of World War I uniforms, this gentleman here was neither a non-commissioned officer, so he has no rank. If you find chevrons on both sleeves of this uniform, and it's a model 1917 type uniform, it is going to be a pre-war uniform. Because in World War I, your rank chevron was only worn on your right sleeve. So if you find a uniform that has chevrons, if he was a corporal or a sergeant or a first sergeant or a battalion sergeant major, and it's on both sleeves, it is probably a pre-war uniform. Because World War I, the rank was only worn on the right sleeve. Your unit designation were on bronze collar discs. Later on, they abandoned these for the simple reason that if the enemy captured you, they could find out everything about you just by looking at your uniform. So eventually, they dropped the idea of putting on your regimental number. That's the first thing the enemy tries to find out. Who are we fighting against? What units are up at the front? So when they captured all these guys, all they had to do is look in the collar discs and they could figure out what regiments, what divisions these guys are in. Division patches, you see these uniforms on eBay for sale. They got the fancy felt division patches. Those patches did not exist during the war. They were all put on after the war. So division patches did exist. This uniform here, minus the discharge stripe, would pretty much be how a soldier would have looked. There was nothing on his uniforms. They weren't adorned with anything at all. Also, the collar discs are a little tricky on uniforms. Buyer beware. A lot of these discs are available to be bought, but they don't necessarily go on the uniform that you have. It's very difficult to put one of these uniforms back together once the collar discs are gone, because if you were in a regular army, you were allowed to wear a US on your right collar. If you were in the National Guard, it was an NG. If you were a draftee, it was called an NA, the National Army. They separated everybody. The regular army had the regimental designations and division designations were one thing. The National Guardsmen had a second, and the draftees, the National Army, had a different number. Those World War I collar discs are very rare and scarce today, and I see it all the time. I see these uniforms for sale, and they have a division patch on them. The first thing I do is to see if anybody had their hands in them. I look to see the collar discs on the uniform, and about 8 out of 10 times, they're just any old generic discs they put on the uniform, and the regimental number doesn't go with the division or the company letter, or they got they have a US designation when they were a National Guard unit. There should be an NG, a collar disc. So buyer beware when you buy these things. People just kind of sauce them up a little bit to sell them. It's better just to buy them without the collar discs, and that's your next hunt, trying to hunt the collar discs down. But along with these uniforms, the United States weren't wearing straight leg pants at the time. They wore these extremely uncomfortable breeches. Now, this is a complete uniform. I got this many years ago from a woman that cleaned out a house. Unfortunately, she did not remember the fellow's name. So it's unfortunate. I have no identification who the fellow was. But this was his complete uniform from World War I. And like I said, this is about where his waist was. All these uniforms are very small. When you find these, a large jacket is about a size 40, anything down to about a 38. Pants are like 28s, 21 waists, 30 waists are big on the trousers. I have an original World War I uniform I fit in. Now, I'm a 44 jacket and a 36 waist and a 32 inseam. It took me 10 years to find an original uniform that I fit in. When I told somebody what I was looking for, they said, good luck, because only 3% of the uniforms ever made were past the size 40. So I was looking for a needle in a haystack.
Strings on the bottom for the
Tie up the calves. No, you just tied the calves up tight. These were very tight around your ankles and very baggy in the thighs. It's not a very comfortable uniform. That's why I didn't wear it tonight. I don't mind wearing it for a little while. I don't know how these guys wore these things, but it's very constricting. And the coat is cut very to the body. Under that tunic, you had to wear this wool pullover shirt. Now, this is a standard model 1917 wool pullover shirt. Now, this is what's called a model 1911 pattern. It came out in 1911. This shirt was all the way up until about 1938, and then it turned into a button-down shirt, which like they wore in World War II. Now, mind you, World War II, the uniform was still wool. the World War II combat uniform for the European theater is almost the same uniform. They didn't wear the tunic like that, but it was a wool shirt and a pair of wool pants. If you're in a Pacific theater, you were wearing your HBTs, your herringbone twills, which were cotton. But the military uniform in the United States was wool. And all the way through, up through Korea, it was still wool. I don't know when they got away from wool, but wool was the garment of choice or the material of choice for the uniform. But for those of us who can't wear wool, don't worry, it wasn't against your body, because these are a pair of Army issue long johns. There they are. This is a size 40. That's why they survived. A little bit larger size than normal. But you wore these wool long johns underneath of the shirt, underneath of these breeches. There were T-shirts. They're hard to find. I don't have any, but there was a. They didn't look really much or any different than the T-shirts I wear today. White T-shirt with your long johns, of course, your wool uniform, and then you wore these heavy wool socks. Okay, these are the socks, very heavy wool. These are the Army issue wool socks. And then you would stuff them into your model 1917 shoes. Now, this is one of the first things that they changed. The service shoe that we used in the States was a little bit different. They found that the service shoe that we were wearing here was not well equipped for the sodden and muddy trenches in Europe, so they had to redesign the shoe. I think they call these sometimes Pershing shoes, but they were redesigned with hobnails on the bottom and heel plates to keep them from wearing out. And they were made of a very, very heavy russet leather. And these would have been the standard issue combat shoes. Now, the soldiers went over wearing the model 1910 leggings or spats around the upper part of your shoe, and it covered those laces. But they found that over there in the trenches, these didn't work out very well. So one of the first changes to the American uniform and equipment was the adoption of what we call the puttees. Now, the Germans, the French, the British had started employing these very early. In fact, most of the European countries were already using these, while the Americans were still using a canvas legging. These go on, there's a special way to wrap them, but they go around the lower part of your leg, kind of almost like an ace bandage. And these were basically just really there to protect the lower part of the trousers. They don't really afford the same protection as the canvas. The canvas leggings kept briars and brambles and rocks and sticks from getting down in your shoes, and also kept you from tearing the lower part of your pant legs. These really were just additional wool wrapped around your legs, probably to just reinforce the bottom part of your trousers a little bit. It really didn't help as far as just keeping dirt and debris out of your shoes. But this is one of the first changes of equipment that the American soldiers underwent when they went there. Along with, one thing that they had to change was the beloved 1911 campaign hat went out, and the overseas or garrison cap came in. Now, they found that these were not very effective or well suited for the overseas in the trenches. First of all, they were hard to store, they were bulky, and most of the European countries were starting to wear the wool overseas cap, which kept your head a little bit warmer than the old campaign hat. And this basic style hat went all the way back to the Spanish-American War, hadn't really changed much by World War I. And they had adopted the overseas cap because also this could be worn under the helmet, and we're going to get to that. That was another additional piece of equipment that American soldiers had to pick up when they went over there, because head wounds. And once again, Americans there were no helmets. You wore the camp, and the state sides here, you were wearing the helmet. Other things that the soldiers wore, this is called a jerkin, or it's a vest. Something else is to keep you a little bit warmer. Usually, people that were in the rear echelon were issued these jerkins a lot. You didn't see them too much with infantrymen in the front line, but artillerymen, truck drivers, guys who went into the tank service later on wore them a lot to keep them warm. You also wore, and this gentleman over here is asking about the heavy wool coats. This is the heavy wool trench coat. All right, great coat, trench coat. This thing here, believe it or not, you won't be able to hold it out very long. Just putting this on would tire you out. This in itself was like a blanket. This would keep you warm. It's probably every bit of almost 3/8 of an inch thick wool. And if you know anything about wool, wool is tough. So the heavy wool overcoat, and this is an interesting one. This fella here that I got this has got a Wagoneer's patch on it, still for the horse-drawn wagons that they had. That was his specialty. He was a Wagoneer. He was a teamster. So this coat here is very warm. I wish I could find one that I fit in now for the winter. Other things you saw behind the line, these were early turn of the century. These were the brown duck canvas fatigue hats that they would wear. They still were wearing these style hats up through World War II. They used to call them a Daisy May hat. But they came out in the early 1900s. Soldiers were wearing them. Most of the time behind the lines, soldiers were not wearing the tunics. They usually just had their pants on and their shirts and their overseas caps. You'll see a lot of pictures of soldiers up in the front trenches. They didn't have the tunics on. It's just very bulky. They needed to be comfortable. They needed to be able to move. For behind the lines, this is your standard bell cap. Probably not seen a lot by enlisted men in Europe, but in the stateside here, if you were going out on the town, you would put your nice clean uniform on and you would wear your dress cap. I don't know what model this is. I don't know if it's sure if it's a 1902 pattern or not, but it changed a little bit as by World War II, they were a little bit different. You also notice that all the World War I equipment or uniforms are made of a very, very coarse, scratchy wool. By World War II, it was a little bit more of a finer wool. And the olive drab that they used, a lot of it had more of a yellowish tint to it than really a true OD green. They actually still were calling this khaki, although we call it OD green. The Army called it khaki. Also for winter, this was the model 1907 winter hat. And this is all made of cloth, and this will pull down over your ears. So these were issued out to the guys in the trenches in the wintertime. So your overcoat and your 1907 hat, that's how you stay warm. So far, with the uniforms, does anybody have any questions? Everybody good so far? All right. Now the equipment. This is where a lot of changes came in as far as the equipment was concerned. You have a question?
Just since you're leaving uniforms, were they made around here? Was there a factory in Red Bank?
Yes, there was.
A great deal of them.
I believe this one was made in Red Bank because this was a New Jersey soldier. It's the Galleria now in Red Bank. That was the what was the name of the Eisner, yes. I have a number of World War I uniforms that were made by him. I believe this one, I think, is. Yep, Eisner Brothers and Gilbert. There was another name on it. Yeah, I think this, or maybe it's not Eisner. What is this? Oh no, Siegel Brothers and Gilbert. I do have an Eisner. I do have an Eisner brother, a couple of Eisner brother uniforms. Yep, they were made here and they were made in New York. They were made in New York and in New Jersey. A lot of the World War I uniforms were made there. I don't know about World War II, but World War I they were big. Anything else on the clothing?
Gloves. Gloves they had.
Yeah, they had what were called they almost looked like this color. They were called rag wool gloves, and they were fingerless.
Oh, right.
The thumbs, and they came up to here. And they also had mittens. And they had on the trigger hand, there was a slot to get your hand out for the trigger finger. So they had rag wool gloves, and they did have mittens. But some of these items, anything that was that could be pressed into service after the war, Army-Navy stores sprung up in the 50s, and a lot of this stuff just got bought out. You know, that's why you can't find World War II HBTs that you fit in anymore. Everybody was buying those cotton herringbone twilled jackets and pants to wear for painting. They wrecked all this stuff. It's all gone. That's why, hence the rarity of a lot of it. A lot of the World War I stuff was the same things. These shoes were worn by workmen and stuff like that. They're gone. It's hard to find any of that stuff that's not like equipment oriented, clothing oriented, gone. Pretty much gone.
That hat is known as a garrison.
Which one? This?
No, the one with the brim on.
All right, well, they called this a garrison cap in World War I.
These cap, they call that.
World War I, this was called a garrison.
Yeah, but the other one is a garrison, was the garrison cap when I was there.
Yeah, I don't know. Some of the terminology might have flipped. This was called the garrison cap in World War I. I don't know what they actually called this. I only know it as the dress cap.
What we called it when I was there, it was a garrison cap.
Right.
I had one.
Yeah, see the term, this was not an American, these were not an American item at the time. So the Army actually only officially adopted this hat in 1938. This was not considered an American military issue piece of equipment.
During World War II, the Germans wore hats like that.
Well, they all did. The French had them. It's actually, I believe, like it's more of like a Serbian, Serbian army. That's where they originated from. These are a little bit different than the World War II versions. But the Germans, the French, the Germans, except for the British. The British never wore these in World War I. They always wore a visored cap. But these were popular with all the countries. But in the United States wore them unofficially. When they came back to statesides, campaign hat, these were not to be worn, and then eventually the Army adopted these and put them into their regular part of the uniform, and they phased out the campaign hat in 1940. By 1940, the Army, the campaign hat had been phased out. So everybody going into World War II, pretty much, although my dad was stationed down in South in the late 30s before World War II, and he had a campaign hat, because that's what they were still wearing those at the time. So everybody go with the uniforms? We good? All right, the equipment. This is where the big facelift came in. They got rid of the blanket rolls and the wooden packs, the packs with wooden staves and leather straps and haversacks to carry your food in and blanket rolls. The soldiers of 1898 going off the Spanish American War looked like a bunch of hobos. Looked like a bunch of hobos going off with all kinds of stuff just dangling off them, because they didn't have no proper way to store a lot of the equipment. Plus, there was very limited amount of equipment that they issued out to the soldiers prior to 1910. After the Spanish-American War, they realized that there was things that the soldiers needed to have on their personal being to be comfortable in the field. So they redesigned all the equipment, and they made it more what we would call today ergonomic, okay, more functional. Some of the things worked out very good. Some of the things didn't. One of the things that didn't work out very well was the pack. Now, they redesigned the backpack, and this device came out in 1910. Now, the first time I saw one of these, I thought it was like a giant diaper of some sort. I don't know exactly what I was looking at here. And though to put this thing together, you almost need to be a college graduate. There is a whole way that this thing has to be assembled to carry everything in it that you need to carry. And believe it or not, everything that's on this table will go into this pack. Yeah, I know. It's amazing. It's kind of like the 3 loaves and the 3 fishes and the 2 loaves. If you do it right, it'll work. The problem is it was only designed to carry the official equipment and load that you were supposed to carry. The other problem was, if you wanted to get something out of it that was in the middle of it, you had to take the whole thing apart. And it turned out to be not a very, very practical pack. The other problem was the pack could not be worn just as a pack without the cartridge belt. These straps, and the cartridge belt's over there with the load-bearing suspenders on it, this pack was designed where you were always to have your pistol belt or your cartridge belt on. There's holes on these belts, gusset holes. All kinds of things are designed to hang off of these belts. It's kind of like Tim the Tool Guy, all right, Taylor? Well, this pack was designed just to basically go over your shoulder, and then this would hook to your cartridge belt. Problem is, if you're not wearing a cartridge belt, you can't wear your pack. All right? So the pack turned out to be, although it was ingenious and revolutionary, it turned out to be one of the things that didn't work out quite as well. But believe it or not, they were still in service up through World War II. And the soldiers that stormed the beach in Normandy, and my father went over to the Pacific Theater, they were still using this pack. Most of the time, they were using it only for this little device on the top, which became the haversack, where your mess kit and your cooking utensils things were carried. The rest of this thing was designed, and it all opens up flat, to carry your shelter tent, your bedding, your change of clothing, your emergency rations, your shaving kit, your spare pair of socks, everything else. It all gets put together. There's a photograph up here after you can look at it. I did assemble it once. I had nothing to do one weekend, and so I lost 3 hours of my life that I will never reclaim again. Here's a picture of a soldier with it all assembled on the back with the shovel. It does go together. It works. It's just, it was not a favorite of the soldiers. And in World War II, most of the soldiers only carried the upper half and not the lower half, and did away with even carrying a blanket at all. They just carried their rations and things in the upper part of the pack and just did away without a blanket and all. One thing they redesigned was the canteen. They went from the round spheroid model 1878 canteen to the more familiar model 1910 canteen. And now they put it in a nice canvas bag, which was insulated, and you had a canteen and you had a cup assembly. For anybody that was in the service up through Korea, should have recognized these. They didn't change. I think they were still probably using these. National Guardsmen were probably still using these in the early 60s, probably still. But this is what's referred to as the 1910 canteen and cup assembly. The mess kits. They went from tinned iron, which tended to rust, to aluminum. We call this a mess kit. The real Army designation for this is called a meat can. It's designed to turn into a frying pan and an eating plate, all right? But when it's closed, you're supposed to carry your meat ration in here, and that's why they called it a meat can. Later on, by World War II, it was referred to as a mess kit. But by World War I, this was still considered what's called a meat can. They also gave you, why I don't know, to separate it, they gave you a bacon can. See, they loved bacon even in those days, and it's even listed right on the top, model 1916, and this is called a bacon can, to put your meats or your bacon in here. And they were tinned iron, and this would keep the grease and everything else from getting into all your clothes and all. They also issued you a condiment can. Now, this was designed to, this is in sections. One side you were to carry coffee. Other side, oh, sorry, this is the coffee side. This side here, the coffee went in. This side, sugar went in. And then this little top pops off, and this cap becomes a container for salt. So you could carry salt, sugar, and coffee in this can. The reason why all this stuff is the way it is because of gas. The poison gas, all the foods had to be in containers. Because if you had food out in paper cartons or containers, the poison gas could infiltrate or absorb into the food and poison you. So everything had to be sealed in containers. This is a very rare container of hard bread from World War I. It's never been opened. Inside here, 2 of these were carried by a soldier. These were the emergency rations. You carried your bacon and your hard bread, and they were sealed in containers, and this inside are crackers or very thick biscuits. The company that made these was Nabisco, and we remember these later until they went out of distribution about how many years ago? Unita biscuits. That's what they were. They were thick, like a thick saltine cracker. That's what's in here. You also carried your utensils. By then, they issued out these tinned, government issued. Oh, yeah. Big spoon, big fork, and a knife. This is your model 1910 utensil set. And the knife and fork and spoon were carried in these little leather sheaths, just like that. And they went inside this haversack. So when you open this haversack up, there's little compartments in here for your knife, fork, and spoon, and then the mess kit or your meat can goes right into here, and that's how that would be carried. Then wrapped up in your blanket and all would have been all of your other personal effects and things. So if you needed to get to your razor, you had to unpack your entire pack. Rolled up in there would have been your 3 pegs and your 1 set of sticks for your shelter tent and your blanket. Now, basically, it's not really difficult. There's a certain way you have to lay this all out. You basically lay the blanket, you lay the ground or the shelter tent down, the blanket goes on top, and then everything has to go in a certain spot on the blanket, and then you roll this whole thing up like a tortilla, you fold it in half, and then you open this thing up with all these straps, and you slide it in, and you buckle it all together. So basically, to get to your belongings, you have to unroll your blanket, and when you unroll it, everything's just laying out on your blanket. And that's why it became a hassle for the soldiers. If you needed to get to another pair of socks, you had to take your pack off, you had to take all these straps apart, you had to unroll everything, you had to take your socks out, and then you had to roll everything back up and put this whole thing back together. So it wasn't practical. Ingenious, wasn't practical. Two things that they had to adopt once they got over there was a helmet. Now, this is the British pattern Brodie helmet, model 1917. The United States looked at the French helmet. They didn't like the French helmet. They looked at the British helmet. They liked the British helmet, so we adopted the British model 1916 helmet. These were used up to 1940, and then we moved over to the M1 helmet. The British continued to use these through the beginning of World War II up to 1944, and then they reissued a new helmet. But this magnesium steel shrapnel helmet was a standard issue helmet. Something new to the Doughboys kit, something he had to adopt, was the helmet, steel helmet. And along with that was the gas mask. Now, I'm not going to open this up because they're actually very fragile, and I actually have one that I lent Peggy. It's in your museum. It's opened. This is a British box respirator type gas mask. There's two positionings on the strap here. All right, when you're not in combat, you always had to have this on. This is how it would be worn. Inside here is a rubberized mask with a fabric hose, and then there is a charcoal-activated canister filter that's in the bag. When the gas shells were sent over, the gas alarm would go off. You had to move this up to a donning position, and that's where it was before. This gets pulled up. This gets pulled up and hooked short. So now this thing is up like this on your neck, and you have to don your mask, get a seal, and then you have to wear the mask. And you would wear this until the all clear was given with the poison gas. Now, there's different types of gases. Not all were poison. They did use sometimes tear gases. The object of the gases was to get the guys out of the trenches. So anything that was annoying. They used tear gas. They used like a pepper gas. They used all kinds of gases. The deadly gases were the mustard and the phosgene. Those would kill you if you inhaled in any of it. If it didn't kill you, it left you with some side effects that took months for the effects to go. Temporary blindness, nausea, scarring of the lungs. The mustard gas was extremely dangerous because anywhere where there was moisture on your body, it burnt. So if you were sweating, your armpits, your groin, if you had moisture there and the gas got through your clothing, it would burn you like a chemical burn. The mucous membranes in your eyes, it would leave you with temporary blindness. If you breathed it in and scorched your lungs, if it didn't kill you, you had long-term effects from having the gas. That's the mustard gas. The phosgene gas just killed you. If you came in contact with phosgene gas, you pretty much were a goner. And people had elements of that in their homes all the way through the 1960s. And as a fireman, I always tell people this. If any of you people have any of those glass, Red Comet fire extinguishers in your houses, little glass balls, they're kind of unique looking. They're different colors, red and blue, and they're on a little wire frame. The chemical in there is carbon tetrachloride. And when it is heated up and turns into a gas, it is phosgene gas. And it was also used in fire extinguishers to put out fires. It works very well. If you read the instructions on those things, it says throw a base of flame and run. There's a reason. Don't throw it at the base of flame and hang around to see what the effects are of you throwing the fire extinguisher, because you're going to die. And people have these things in their homes and they think they're full of water or a brine solution. The old ones were. The ones from the 30s, 40s, and 50s are not. They contain this carbon tetrachloride, and besides causing phosgene gas, it's extremely carcinogenic and cancer-causing. So if you have those things in your house, get rid of them. They're extremely dangerous. Okay? So that's my fire department warning to you all. All right.
When the pack is fully loaded, how much does it weigh?
Probably about 20 pounds, 15, 20 pounds. There's really not a lot here. It's just very cumbersome. This is a little personal wash basin. They would issue these out to like a little squad. Everybody so you could fill them up with water. This is a brand new unissued one, so it still has the linseed oil still on it. So you can fill this up with water and clean yourself. Speaking of the gas, this is a gas alarm or a gas rattle. They're like the old noisemakers when you spin them. I'm not going to because this is 100 years old and it probably will crack, but it gives you that. All right. And I went the opposite way. If I go the other way, it's really loud, and they would spin these. So the sentries who had to watch for the gas would have this to their, and they would ring these. So when they heard that, everybody had to put their gas masks on. The problem with the gas is after it cleared, it tended to lay low in the holes. So if you were down in the shell hole or down in the trenches, you had a problem because it didn't leave right away. You had to make sure you had to ventilate it out. So the gas was a big problem. So the helmet, personal items. Soldiers didn't have a lot of pockets, so these were very popular. This is a government issue. This is what we would call like a money belt or a personal effects belt. Soldiers had these under their personal effects to keep, anything that had a value in there. Army issue handkerchiefs. Gave the soldiers handkerchiefs. These were made by the American Red Cross. These were little ditty bags, and they handed them out to the soldiers to keep their little, their shaving kits, their little personal effects in there. Soap was usually carried in a little aluminum, this is all government issue stuff. A soap container, a shaving mirror or a signaling mirror. There's a whole host of shaving kits the soldiers used. This is a Salvation Army donated one. Straight razor, has a mirror in it, extra blades. This one here has an attachment on it so you can actually shave your hair, cut your hair with it. Straight razors, and just coming out at that time were the safety razors that took the regular double-edged blades. They were popular with the soldiers. Toothbrushes. These are original bone handle with boar badger bristles. Army issued toothbrushes. Trench lighters. These were slow match. I don't know how these worked. Some of you here may know. I think the wick had to be soaked in something, and then you could light it, and it just kind of glows. So if you use tobacco products, cigarettes, or pipes, mostly cigarettes, this is what you would use to light up. Because if you put an open flame out in the trenches, you could have been a goner. What was that movie back in the 30s? 3 on a Match. It was an old thing. You never let a match burning long enough for 3 people to light off, because somebody that was a sharpshooter sniper would probably kill one of you. So that was an old thing. 3 on a match. Never leave anything, an open flame going longer than you could light off 3 cigarettes or 3 pipes. Playing cards, government issued servicemen playing cards to keep you occupied down in the trenches. Combs were made of horn. And some of them were really fine to get rid of the lice, if you had lice. Most of the soldiers like to cut their hair really, really short. This is a trench mirror, but this had a double function. As a mirror, and there's an aperture for putting on the end of your bayonet, so you could stick it over the trench, so you could take a look to see what was down line. And actually, these became popular and collectible after the movie Save It, Private Ryan. At the very beginning of the movie, he puts one of these on the end of a bayonet on an M1 rifle, and everybody's like, what the devil's that? Well, it actually was a World War I, and they really weren't being used in World War II, but for some reason they had one of these in the movie, and everybody was like, well, so these became popular. Now the market dried up on these. They're hard to find, and any good ones with the mirrors not all broken out of them. Dog tags became a problem for the soldiers. Remember, U.S. soldiers never left the continent. Now they had a problem. They're sending people overseas. How are we going to track them? Now, these are original dog tags, and they are dog tags because they needed something quick to come up with a way to identify these soldiers. Because if the soldier was on maneuvers here and got hurt, someone's going to identify him. He's over there in Europe, mixed in the ranks with British or French. He's an American soldier, one of 100,000 men or 30,000 men. How are we going to figure out who this guy is? So they had to come up with identification. And this was the first time dog tags started to come out. And they're very crudely made with individual letter stamps. I think they did them right there in the barracks when the guys were made, and they issued them out. And they were on a shoelace, regular shoelace from your shoes, and you had 2 tags. One tag was on the main shoelace, and then they tied off the second tag on the shoelace with a little small tag. The reason being is one stayed with the body, and the other one gets turned in to the non-commissioned officer or officer that you were deceased. So one stays with you to identify the body. The other one gets turned in for recording purposes. And that policy has stayed and still as it's done now. Your other countries use other forms of identification. They all use some form of identification or dog tag, all the countries in World War I. But the US, this is one thing that they had to come up with quick, so dog tags. Same thing that your dog would have been running around with around his neck in 1914, 1915. This device here, where they were manufactured overseas, this is, some of you guys might have had these as kids. This is what they would use to look over top of a trench. Kind of look it out, and it gives you a mirror reflective image. They actually had pretty fancy ones that were like binoculars. These were more for like enlisted men to just take a gander over because, you didn't want to really stick your head up there too long. And a lot of guys, it was known, I forgot the term, what they called it, but when guys wanted to get out of duty for a while, they sometimes would just stick their hand over the trench for a little bit, and I think both sides just helped each other out every now and then, and would shoot your hand or whatever, get you out of combat duty for a while. The trench whistle. Now, usually the non-commissioned officer or the officer of the company carried one. This was the signal for going over the top. For anybody that knows how World War I was fought, by 1915, everything was pretty much a stalemate. They were entrenched. They were just going back and forth. You had your no man's land. It was just mass infantry assaulting a trench and then a counterattack. They would line these poor guys up. When they got attacked, the officer would blow the whistle. Over the side you went, and then you would go. So these aren't too much of a common find anymore, but these were usually carried by the officers to send you over the top. And the other thing which is unique is watches. This is the watch that made the dollar famous. This is an Ingersoll Yankee watch. This is a World War I soldier's watch. They were made with a black dial, and they glowed so you could see them. Does anybody know what they used to make these things glow? Radium, yeah. And they stopped that when they found all the women that used to paint the dials were all dying of bone cancer and stuff. But this is still an operating World War I Ingersoll Rand dollar watch. It's just typical soldier's watch that they would carry in their uniform, so it keeps pretty good time still too. They're non-rebuildable, so I don't like winding it up too much. We go on to personal items. Anybody have any questions on anything I didn't cover or anything you want to know about?
What in the way of duplication did you have with the clothing?
Oh, you did. You had a spare pair of socks, a spare pair of drawers, and an undershirt. And you had a outer shirt. You did not carry another pair of breeches, tunic, or shoes. So what you basically did was you had to swap out your underwear and your socks and your shirt and wash them. And if that got to be in bad condition, you go to the quartermaster and you get another one of those issues. So you carried an overcoat. A lot of soldiers eliminated the blanket and just carried the overcoat. That thing's so heavy, you pump yourself up with that, you go to bed. The tents were very rarely set up as shelter tents. They're an oiled canvas. You put it down, you basically just use it to keep the dampness or the dirt off of you. Most of these guys were living in dugouts in caves inside of the walls when it got into the trenches. Remember, after 1914, after 15, open warfare was gone. These guys dug in. These trenches were like 8 foot deep, 4 to 5 foot wide, and there were burrows inside. They were living in holes in the dirt, in the ground. And these trenches ran for miles. And they were filled with water. And they were filled with rats. And they were filled with vermin. And from soldiers' feet being wet all the time, they got trench foot. They got all kinds of diseases from being in the water all the time. I'll tell you, the soldiers of World War II didn't have it as miserable as the soldiers in World War I did. Now, the Americans only did it for 1 year. Think of the French, the Germans, the Austrians, these guys that did this for like 3 years. Shell shock, we call it PTSD today, ran rampant. These guys used to sit there, look like they're having seizures. They would be stuck down in these trenches. Bombardments would last 24 hours. You didn't know from 1 minute to the next whether the roof you were under was going to cave in and bury you alive. In fact, last year, they found on the western front, they found a trench that had caved in with 50 German soldiers in them, buried them alive. They identified them all and sent their remains back to their families, their surviving families. But they're still finding this. when World War II came along, the refuse from World War I was still on the battlefields. You go out to France now, the farmers are still using barbed wire from World War I in places. There's still unexploded ordnance and grenades and shells in the woods in France. They still find German steel helmets from World War I. They're digging them up. The refuse from that war is more prevalent over there in France than the World War II stuff is. Just from the amount of material that was used and went through. So did that answer your question? Yeah, there you go, okay. All right, now we're getting into the weaponry. Hand grenades. The United States had tried a hand grenade in the late 1890s. It didn't work out very well, so they got away from them. World War I came, that became the new test ground for all different kinds of hand grenades. So the Americans finally settled on this. This is a Mark I, it's our design. We took all the best elements of the British and the French grenade, two type hand grenades that were used by the British and the French, the Mills bomb and the French type grenade, and we created the American Mark I, which was great. It was overthought, it was well engineered, but it had one small setback, one problem. It had a tendency not to explode when it was thrown at the enemy. For one reason only. The Americans had safety in mind. And to make this hand grenade work, you had to pull this pin, you had to jiggle it, this little cap fell off. Now, if anybody was in the service in Korean War and even Vietnam, the lever system that's on the hand grenade, which is still being used today, is the Mark II fuse on the, well, no longer the Mark II grenade, it's a Mark II fuse. And it was a redesign of this because how this worked was, they were afraid what was happening. They noticed that soldiers were blowing themselves up with hand grenades in World War I because they were so nervous. They would pull the pins, and most of the grenades didn't have a safety on them. Once you pulled the pin, the fuse started. They were 3 to 5, usually 5 seconds. So once you pulled the pin, you had to get rid of it. What was happening, these poor guys would pull the pin, they would get nervous, they would drop it on the ground. Oh boy, that's 3 seconds gone. By the time they were picking up, they were exploding and they were killing their own men. So the Americans said, we're not gonna let that happen. We're gonna make a safe hand grenade. So they designed this. And how it worked was you basically had to hold it a certain way in your hand, with your thumb over the lever. You pulled the pin, you jiggled the little cap off. Now that exposed the hammer that set the primer off. And what they did was they experimented and watched the motion of a hand throwing a grenade. And they found that the thumb had a tendency to slide across. So when you pull the pin and you drop this cap off, the protective cap, this lever does not flip off like a regular hand grenade. It pivots. And when it pivots, it lets the hammer loose, it swings forward and strikes the cap, which sets the fuse, if you throw it right. So what was happening was guys were pulling the pins on these, shaking the caps off, and they weren't holding them right. So when they threw them, the little thumb wasn't dragging across this lever, and it wasn't turning the lever, so the hammer wasn't coming across in midair. So they were throwing these over at the Germans, and they were falling in the trench. The German would pick it up, throw it back. Maybe when he threw it back, he rotated the lever. Now your hand grenade was coming back at you and it was exploding. So Pershing said, stop making these things, they're not good. So what they did was they basically, this little cap that normally comes off, they took the cap, they extended the spoon or the lever on the cap. So now what happens is the only thing holding the hammer back now is your hand on the spoon. So when you pull the pin, when you throw it, as soon as you take your hand off, the spoon snaps off and ignites the grenade and it explodes. And they came out towards the very end of the war, but the soldiers went into World War I with these Mark I grenades originally. And once again, it was one of these trial and error things. Turned out that they realized they had a problem and they fixed it. And then that fuse now hasn't changed. Since 1918, the fuse on a hand grenade has not changed. So they worked that one out pretty good. Your grenades in World War I were carried in a grenade bag. And they weren't carried by the men all the time. When they would go on raids, 1 or 2 guys in the raiding party would carry a grenade bag. These things would be loaded up, and he would go out, and that one guy would be throwing the hand grenades. Things were done a little differently than they would be done later on in World War II. But this is your typical fragmentation anti-personnel grenade and your grenade bag. World War I, the war of hand-to-hand combat. Every soldier in World War I carried some sort of close combat weapon because once you got over the other side and into the trenches, it was now fighting hand to hand. So trench knives like this were prevalent. They were combination brass knuckles. Even here, you could strike somebody in the top of the head. Of course, it has a needle-sharp quinlan type blade that would puncture you. This is a very difficult wound to dress because it's a triangular. These type knives were outlawed after the war. You couldn't carry triangular. Even the Germans and the French carried a regular double edge. Only the Americans went in with this weapon like this. It's a pretty scary looking weapon. I wouldn't want this coming at you. But most of the soldiers resorted to using medieval type weapons. There were trench maces and trench clubs, literally sticks with iron balls on it with spikes. That's what they would carry into these trenches. Also, they would take the shovels. They would sharpen the edges of the shovels. They would use these for battering people and hitting people. Because once you got down to the trench, a pistol or a weapon like this was all you could use. You couldn't wield the gun around in a trench. So it was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. So at that point in time in the war, when you got in military, when you got down to the enemy trench, you were going to face your opponent face-to-face when you killed him. It wasn't like World War II later on, and, from a distance. When you climbed down in that trench, there was no way out. It's like being in a maze. It was do or die. And it was pretty horrific type combat when you climbed down to an enemy trench. This, though, is a model 1910 shovel. In a company of men, so many of these shovels were issued out. So many of these were small little picks. This all goes together and makes a little pick. There's a certain ratio of field gear that was given out. Hatchets for building embankments and stuff, cutting down trees. And this bolo, which was used really as like a machete for chopping. These were not used as weapons. These were work tools. But these were every man carried one of these type weapons on the back of the pack. It goes straight on the back of the pack. You're either carrying a bolo, a shovel, an axe, or a pick. Everybody carried that. Also, wire cutters. This is what the soldiers carried on their belts. Climb up, cut the barbed wire. Somebody had to go out first, cut the barbed wire, so that the men would go through, and the barbed wire wasn't just like one string of barbed wire. It would be solid barbed wire from 20, 30 feet deep. So guys had to go climb through there and cut the wire to get them through. And wire parties would go out at night to restring the wire. This was all night long when we got to trenches. They had to get volunteers. People had to go out on wire duty. So while you're trying to repair your wire, the Germans would be shooting up illumination lights and raking the field with machine gun fire to keep you from trying to put the barbed wire up. So you never had a rest. And what a lot of people, you got to realize, this war was fought, it was only in an area. Like the rest of France was fine. It was all along the Belgian-French borders where the war was fought for the Western Front. And of course, the Eastern Theater was same way. Then you had, for the British, they were down in Gallipoli, but the Western Front was just like a giant, minefield. It's just, the land is still scarred if you go out there. You could still see the trenches. You fly over, you could still see where the trenches were. Because they're just filling in just from nature is what they are. Weaponry. Now, once again, the United States profited from the Spanish-American War, and they found out that their Krag-Jorgensen rifle was not the best suited weapon for the Army to have. And the Spanish were using the German Mauser model of '92. And they brought the German Mauser rifle back, and they looked at it, and they said, that's a pretty good weapon. So what they did was they redesigned the German Mauser, and we came up with our rifle called the model 1903. And the design of this rifle was to basically eliminate the need to have a cavalry carbine for mounted men and a long rifle for infantry. Now, the Krag-Jorgensen rifle came in two lengths, a carbine, which was about that tall, and the full-length rifle, which was about that tall. So they made the 1903 Springfield, and they dropped it right in the middle, so they only would have to issue one firearm out for both branches of the military, mounted or infantry. And it became the 1903 Springfield rifle. The interesting thing about this is that we had to pay Germany patent infringement. During war, we were at war with Germany, and they had won a lawsuit against the American government. And so the Mauser Corporation had won a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the United States government, and they had a patent infringement because this basically is a copy of the German Mauser action, which is probably the strongest and one of the best bolt-action designs. It's a double locking lug magazine rifle. Now, there were no semi-automatic weapons in the hands of infantrymen at the time. They were all bolt-action rifles. They operated off of what was called a stripper clip, 5 bullets on a little tin little thing. Each soldier, when you went to use the rifle, you had to take out of your cartridge belt. Well, I'll get back to that. You sit this right on the top like that. You push these in. Now you can open and close the bolt 5 times. On the 5th shot, the bolt locks out. That's how you know you're out. So you have to go back into your little cartridge belt, take out another clip, push them all in, and this was the standard infantry weapon for the United States soldiers from 1906 up until 1938 when they adopted the M1 rifle. Now, it is called the 1903, that's when it was designed, but it wasn't in the hands of the servicemen until 1906. The gun is also designed to use a bayonet. This is the model 1905 bayonet. And the original bayonets were blued like the guns so that they, or the World War I versions were blued like the gun so they wouldn't distract, you wouldn't see the gleaming bayonets. Earlier bayonets were bright. World War I period bayonets are blued. And this was the standard weapon for the regular army. Now, the United States, up until 1917, was making a lot of money off of the war, especially with Great Britain. We were producing the P-14 or pattern 14 rifle for Great Britain. The National Armory, Springfield, was making these. They didn't make a lot because the Army wasn't really big. But Winchester, Eddystone, Remington, private contract were making weapons for Great Britain. They were making their model P-14 rifle. Now we entered the war. Guess what? We didn't have enough modern weapons for our servicemen. Some of them were still using the Krag Jorgensen rifle, which is a very good rifle, but not suited to go overseas with. What are we going to do? So all these contract companies retooled, and they made a couple small modifications to the British rifle, and we made what was called now the model 1917. And it's basically the British P-14 rechambered for our 30-06 cartridge. The bayonet's a little different than the British bayonet. This is the bayonet that goes on the... And most all of your National Guardsmen and definitely your draftees went overseas with the model 1917 rifle. There was more of these manufactured and in service than the model 1903 rifle at the end of World War I. This almost became the standard American issue weapon into the advent or the adoption of the M1 rifle. The reason being is that they pulled away from this because it was a foreign design, but these outnumbered the 1903 Springfields probably like 2 or 3 to 1. There were so many of these. That's exactly what this is. It's like almost a brand new World War I rifle. You could probably buy these in Army, Navy stores and sporting goods stores in the 60s for a couple $100, or probably less than $100. There was hundreds of thousands of these guns made. Now it's really hard to find one that hasn't been sporterized. But at one time, these guns were a dime a dozen. They're very rugged, they're very strong. They're chambered for the standard model 1906 or 30-06 cartridge. And this is the weapon that most of all the doughboys were carrying in World War I. Now, I heard you say you're going to be watching that movie, Sergeant York, very soon. Sergeant York's unit was actually issued the 1917. But there was a lot of debate over what weapon Alvin York used for his escapades in World War I, where he won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it was recently, they finally ironed out through family tradition and stories what had happened. He trained in the States with a 1903 rifle. When they went overseas, they were issued the model 1917. He didn't like it. He didn't like the model 1917 rifle. Somehow or other, he was able to obtain or get a 1903 Springfield. So there was big debate about Sergeant York, Alvin York, what he used. And everybody says that his unit, they were all issued P-17s or model 1917s. He had to use a 17. And his son said, no, my father used a 1903 Springfield. And they debated this for years. And somehow or other, they recently just ironed it all out. What happened was he somehow or other got one. So the gun that he used was a model 1903 Springfield. And I think that's what you're going to see him using in the movie. They didn't know that at the time, but there was big controversy about that afterwards, what gun he actually used. I think, and the problem is it would be great to find that gun because, you know, they still have records on what your serial number for your weapon was. Problem was that was not his original issued weapon. So whatever happened to that famous gun that he used, he shot those 78 Germans with, is probably ended up, could be on someone's sporterized rack right now in somebody's house. But it was a 1903 Springfield they used. Now, with that was the 1917 cartridge belt. And this is how the cartridges were carried. This right now is set up with what's called the load-bearing suspenders. This gets kind of heavy when you load it up with all the cartridges. But once you put this on, that's how it would be. Now, you could carry your canteen and your first aid pouch on the other side, and that's how most of the soldiers went into combat. They wouldn't carry the packs, and when they went across for going to no man's land, it was basically ammunition, a knife, a club, your rifle, and that's how you went in. Any questions on the weapons?
How many cartridges?
All right, each one of these pockets would hold 3 5-round clips. You put 2 down, the 2 up and 1 in the middle down. So 15 per pocket. So it's a 10 pocket belt. So that's 150 rounds of ammunition, 150 shots. And it gets quite heavy once you load it up like that.
With all the different guns that they had, with using different rifles, how do they keep everything straight?
Well, the British used the 308, the French used the Lebel, the Americans used the model 1906 cartridge. Originally, this gun was chambered in 30-03 for 1903. That cartridge was abandoned in 1906. They came out with a more familiar and famous 30-06. 30 caliber, 06 is the year it was developed. So the model 1917 and the 1903 both used the 30-06 cartridge. So one cartridge fit everything. The service revolvers were either the old 38 Colt, the long, or the model 1917 revolver that took the 45 ACP round, or the 45 caliber 1911 automatic pistol. Officers carried them. Sergeants maybe would get a revolver, a 1917 revolver. But enlistment didn't carry any handguns. Maybe a sergeant could get a handgun, but officers usually carried a pistol. Enlistment all carried a long rifle. How are we with the weapons? Question?
When I took my basic training in 1943, we used Enfield rifles because there weren't enough M1.
That's it. They call this the...
Put a quarter down to hold the inspection arm.
That's it right here.
You had to put a quarter in it, inspection arm, so that it would flip
up. They call this, they used to call this the American Enfield, because that was the actual name. It was a pattern 1914 Enfield. They called them the American Enfield. Like I says, World War II, they were still using these for trainers. A lot of these were still in armories in the 1960s, National Guard armories. They used them for like parade guns and stuff. There was like 3 of these for every one of those 03 Springfields that were ever made. They're heavy, a lot heavier, but they're very good fire. They're very good arms. In fact, the basis for this gun in World War II was a sniper rifle. The 03A3 with the scope on it was a sniper rifle. This is extremely accurate weapon. It's 200-300 yards. The hands of a well-trained soldier could hit a target. The 1903's rifle is a very, very good rifle. My father preferred this over the M1 rifle when he was in World War II. And then he got stuck with a M1 carbine that was full auto with a banana clip. He thought that was a real piece of crap. He preferred the 1903 Springfield over the M1 rifle. He used to say, you know, if you dropped an M1 rifle off a truck, you had parts left, because there's all kinds of gizmos and springs in them. There's nothing to these. You drop that off a cliff, you go down, pick it up, it still works. So my father preferred the 03 over an M1. In fact, in World War II, the United States was the only country that had its men armed with semi-automatic weapon. Everybody else was still using bolt action. Wrapping this up, awards. World War I, there was no Bronze Star. There was no Silver Star. There was a Silver Citation. And there was no Purple Heart. So if you got wounded in the service, this is what you got. This is called a wound certificate. And with that, you got a little lapel pin, a little silver lapel pin that you wore on your lapel that showed that you were wounded in service. In 1932, they reinstituted the Purple Heart. So what they did is they allowed any soldier that was ever wounded in combat to apply for the Purple Heart. But to get the Purple Heart, you had to turn this in. So these are very rare to find one. This is an original. They're signed by the President of the United States. These are the wound certificates that a soldier got when he was wounded in the service. And some soldiers opted to keep these. Other soldiers wanted the Purple Hearts. The Silver Star was not a medal. It was called the Silver Citation. And it was an itty-bitty, tiny little, anybody who was ever in the service and got a bronze combat star on your right? Well, there was a silver one that you got on your campaign ribbon, which was the Silver Citation. Later on, that tiny, itty-bitty little solid silver star was put into the center of a large star and made into the Silver Star. And the Silver Star is actually that itty-bitty tiny little silver star that's in the middle of the big silver star that they give out today. That's the actual Silver Star. It's in the middle now. And you will find every now and then, they're rare to find a campaign ribbon with a Silver Star on it. There wasn't the same amount of awards that they had in World War I that they had in World War II. But this is what's called a wound certificate. Honorable service, you got a bronze little lapel pin, and if you were wounded, you got a silver one. And this is a reissue of a Purple Heart from Mr. James Lake from Long Branch, who wanted a Purple Heart. So he put in for a Purple Heart. And the interesting thing about the Purple Heart, the oldest Purple Heart awards are, there's about less than 30, 25 of them for Civil War veterans. Civil War veterans that were still alive in the 30s put in for Purple Hearts, and the government issued them. They're the rarest of the rare for medal collectors if you can find a Purple Heart that was issued out to a Civil War veteran. So that's it. If anybody has any questions.
I got a question. The gentleman who trained for World War II, I give him all the credit in the world, because I trained when I was in the military with the M1. That sucker was jammed. If you looked at it,
My father hated it.
It was jammed. So how these guys won World War II with the M1?
My father didn't.
Credit.
My father hated
I
them.
give them applause.
Yeah. My father spent 1938 to 1946 in the Pacific Theater fighting the Japanese, and he didn't like the M1 rifle, and he didn't like the M1 carbine that he got because that wouldn't stop a Jap either, he said. But he would prefer to have had a 1903 Springfield. That's what he trained with, was an 03. And then they gave him an M1, and then when he moved up to a platoon sergeant, they gave him this crappy little M1 carbine. The few that they made that were full autos. A lot of people don't know that. M1 carbines in the middle of summer were full autos with a banana clip, not the little straight clip. And that thing was a piece of crap. He said it only had a little 30 caliber bullet that was about that big. But he liked the M1. He took me shooting when I was a kid with the M1 rifle, with this 03 I meant. He didn't like the M1. He took me shooting with that. And I'm gonna tell you what, anybody's ever shot one of these things? Ooh, you better have some meat on your bones. Because these things kick. They got a kick with them. So I think Paul wants to wrap this up. If anybody has any specific questions before I pack all this stuff up, you're welcome to come up and look at it, but please, lots of don't handle. You notice I've got gloves on for a reason. You're welcome to come up and look at the stuff and ask any questions, but that's all I have for you. Good enough? There you go, Paul.
Thanks, Brian.